This is the beginning of the second tape, which will be on Genesis 12 through the end of the Bible, the end of Genesis, but mostly we'll be focusing on Genesis 12 through 24. Moses, who will be the subject of our third tape, but when he appeared before the Lord at the burning bush, the Israelite God identified himself. He said, "I am the God of your fathers. I am the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob." And it's these three figures that will be our primary concern in this tape. The individuals who are most commonly known as the patriarchs. Patriarchs comes from two Greek roots, as a lot of these words will. Patri, meaning father, and arche, meaning first. So the patriarchs are the first fathers. Now, I'm not exactly comfortable with this term, and the reason being that our focus for today, which is Genesis 12 through 50, our focus for today does not only concern the first fathers, the patriarchs, but it also concerns the matriarchs, which, as you would imagine, means first mothers. Because Abraham's wife, Sarah, Abraham's mistress, Hagar, Isaac's wife, Rebekah, and Jacob's two wives and two mistresses all together make up the stories that we know of as the stories from Genesis 12 through 50. So my preferred term, and the term I'm going to be using, is ancestors, because that's a word that includes both patriarchs and matriarchs. And our primary concern in this, the second unit, are the individuals known as the ancestors of Israel. Now, when we see the shift from Genesis 11 through Genesis 12, and by the way, I gave you a bit of factual misinformation on the previous tape. I said that the Tower of Babel is Genesis chapter 10. In fact, it's Genesis chapter 11. But we see the shift from Genesis chapter 11 and Genesis chapter 12 in two ways. First of all, the focus in Genesis 1 through 11 is all humanity. We start in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 with the first man and the first woman, and then we move on to their children, and then in Genesis 6 through 9, when God destroys the entire world with a flood, we start with a new family, Noah, his wife, their children, their wives, and again, we're dealing with the entirety of humanity. When we shift to Genesis 12, all of a sudden, instead of the entirety of humanity, now we're dealing with a single family. And that is, of course, the family of the first patriarch, whose name through most of his story is Abraham. In the earliest parts of the narrative, his name is Abram, A-B-R-A-M. But we'll be calling him Abraham pretty much all the way through. So that's the first shift that happens from Genesis 1 through 11 through Genesis 12 and following. Is before then we're dealing with the entirety of humanity. Now we're dealing with just a single family. The second change is a bit more subtle. I told you on the previous tape that Genesis 1 through 11 was of the literary type or genre known as myth. Now, the primary actors in myth are supernatural. And so, as we read Genesis 1 through 11, we see that the primary actor is Yahweh, the God, the named God of Israel. When we move to Genesis 12, although this God of Israel named Yahweh, and I will explain that name when we meet together in class, probably our third meeting, this God is certainly active in the ancestral stories, but really there's another actor who reaches the stage, and this is a figure I will refer to here as a kind of a hero. And so what we have is a shift in literary genre from myth to legend. Legends also are stories that people tell about themselves to communicate true things. But whereas myths much more have a tendency to teach kind of the first truths. Who are we? Why are we here? What's our relationship with the infinite? When we move to legendary stories, we're dealing much more, I'm going to give myself some room here. We're dealing in legendary stories much more with issues of national identity. Legends tell us as a people who we are as distinguished from those other people who live on the other side of the mountain. That's what a legend is. And I always like, when I begin a discussion of the ancestors, to talk about some uniquely American legends. Now, once again, a legend is not history. It's not written to be history. It's not meant to be history. So it might have some basis in historical fact, and I will, in fact, be giving you some possible dates when the ancestors might have lived. So it might have some basis in historical fact, but history is not what a legend is interested in. A legend is interested in establishing national identity. So what are some uniquely American legends? The one that comes first to mind, of course, is George Washington, an actual historical figure as far as I know. But there are stories that arose about him that tell us less about George Washington than they do about the way we think of ourselves as a people. For instance, George Washington standing on the front of that boat as the rowers are taking him across the Delaware River to fight against the Hessians on Christmas Eve. That's a visual image which was stamped in my brain in grade school, and I've never forgotten it. And it tells us something about the kind of leaders and the kinds of heroes that we have. George Washington throwing the silver dollar across the Potomac. George Washington chopping down the cherry tree and then telling his father. And everybody knows the words that he says exactly the same. There's no historical basis for this as far as I know. But we all know the exact same story in the exact same order with the exact same words. What is it that George Washington said to his father when his father asked him if he chopped down the cherry tree? He says, "Father, I cannot tell a lie." We all know it in exactly that way. Abraham Lincoln, walking miles in the snow to return a few pennies that he had overcharged somebody when he worked in a store. Abraham Lincoln writing his lessons on the back of a coal shovel. These are all stories that we know about Abraham Lincoln. These are the legends that arise. Now, some of them are less historical. Paul Bunyan, Pecos Bill, Johnny Appleseed, who is a historical figure, but legends rise around them. Well, likewise, the ancestral stories in Genesis 12 through 50 are the legends that the historical political entity people Israel told about themselves that gave them a sense of national identity. This is why when God appears to Moses, he identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's something really unusual about the legends that Israel tells about themselves. Unlike so many other legends that we could read from ancient time, and we do in fact have many of them. I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of them. Hercules, Prometheus, Pandora. Unlike legends of other characters, at least in a matter of degree, I'm sure we could find this in other legends as well, the Israelites seem to delight in telling stories about heroes with clay feet. Delighted in telling stories about heroes with incredible flaws in their character. So we have, for instance, Abraham, who when he moves his family to Egypt, he lies about his wife to save his own skin. He tells the Pharaoh that his wife is, in fact, not his wife, but his sister. And so Pharaoh immediately takes her away from him and marries her. And there's some debate about whether the marriage was in fact consummated or not. But it was all because Abraham was afraid and wanted to save his own skin. And he was afraid that if he said she was his wife, that he'd be killed. Jacob, throughout his entire life, lies and cheats and steals to get what he wants out of his father, out of his brother, out of his brother-in-law. Over and over and over again, he lies. Joseph, terrible, terrible things he says to his father and his mother and his brothers, disrespectful. Over and over and over again, we see the ancestors filled with flaws, doing all sorts of things that we would not approve of. And this is something we'll need to talk about further, but it's characteristic of the Israelite legends that they seem to paint the characters in very realistic tones.